Hello, everyone. I'm Brett Jendra with Truckstop. I'm our channel partner marketing manager. I've got over a decade of experience in the transportation industry, working directly with brokers, carriers, and shippers. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the transportation industry, specifically how fraudulent bad actors have been disrupting the business and the spot market at record high rates. We're going to take this opportunity to discuss some of the most common methods being used right now, some of the ways you can prevent and protect your business from being victims of this type of behavior, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact this has on profitability. But I've got a special guest with us today. That's Chad Eichelberger, the president at Reliance Partners. I'll give him an opportunity to introduce himself before we get into things. Chad, why don't
Hey,
you tell
Brett.
tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, Brett. Hey, thanks for having me on today. Really appreciate the opportunity to connect. So I'm president of Reliance Partners. We specialize in the commercial insurance space for trucking and logistics. We insure more motor carriers than any other agency in the country. We insure almost half in some way, shape, or form of the top 100 freight brokers. And so very active in the space. We're the largest agency in the space dedicated to logistics. So my background prior to this was in the freight brokerage world as both president of Access America and then president of brokerage at Coyote. So have been on both sides of the fence and happy to connect today.
Perfect. So, Chad, we'll get right into things. Right now, what are some of the most common methods of fraud being utilized by some of these nefarious players? That, yeah, I mean, I'll keep it simple. What are the most common methods you're seeing right now?
Well, I think one, everybody in the industry is aware of the double brokering issues that have been persistent. We've seen that grow significantly over the past, call it 12 to 18 months. Everybody's well aware that's affecting the space. And, we're also obviously seeing a lot of identity theft or impersonation that's happening, leading fictitious pickups. And then more recently, we've started to see a new trend of more or less authority purchases that are not even really legitimate purchases, but they're gaining access to login credentials to different websites, whether it be load board or freight broker sites, email systems, you name it. And so certainly all of that, really we classify as strategic theft. Straight theft just as a whole, I don't have statistics on how much it's up, but we do know that it's challenging as well right now. And the geography of where we typically saw just straight cargo theft taking place, it typically is, more confined to Southern California, South Florida, Memphis, Atlanta, Dallas, Chicago, but that has grown in scale too. And we're seeing that spread out all over the country. So, but I would say more so than anywhere else right now, the challenges we're seeing are really around strategic theft, which you can do from behind a computer.
Yeah, the world certainly changed in the last 4 to 5 years, and being able to do things from behind a computer has made it a lot more easier. So I'm sure that that's probably playing a role in some of these types of behaviors. Are there other factors that seem to be playing a role in how or why we're seeing an increase in this type of behavior?
Yeah, I think before, if you go back several years ago, you didn't have, overseas entities that were going after this type of fraud. Before you had cargo theft rings that really were targeting loads, and occasionally there would be an inside job where maybe a driver or trucking company was in on it. But now you've got a lot of individuals that realize, the goal can be stealing the cargo. The goal can be getting an advance from a freight broker on a double brokered load and not paying the carrier. The goal can be to do both. So we're seeing and the goal can be to profit by taking a load at X and paying somebody else and just purely be a straight double broker play. But more often than not, the goal is to steal the cargo and maybe along the way get paid for the load. And, as a byproduct of that, the freight broker oftentimes is left on the hook to pay the legitimate carrier. So, I think there's a lot of factors driving it, but certainly the entrance of, even outside entities into this, along with the players that are doing it domestically, And you're seeing a lot of even authorities that are being purchased in bulk right now that are, and sometimes they're operated for a period of time as a legitimate business. And then suddenly at one time, they go and they hit fast and they take a lot of loads at once and they do it with multiple freight brokers and then they disappear. And so unfortunately, they've grown in scale and they've grown in sophistication.
Yeah, certainly a challenging time and a lot of things to keep in mind if you're trying to run a legitimate business. So what
Sure.
are some things that these legitimate business owners can do to protect themselves from being taken advantage in some of these schemes?
Well, I think there's two sides to that. There's on the freight broker side and there's on the motor carrier side. Motor carriers often are the ones that are being impersonated. If that's the case and it's not, a fraudulent sell of the business where they're paid up front. One, if you're a motor carrier and you are going to cease operations and you get a phone call from somebody and they want to send you $3,000 through a third party payment app for you to give them all your credentials, that is a red flag. That's not a legitimate sale. Don't do it because it's you that they're going to look to at the end of the day and your insurance and, potentially your reputation. So, I think on the motor carrier side, being vigilant's important. Two, I would say oftentimes this any type of impersonation that we're seeing, there's a way to catch it along the way. It's subscribing and working with the different monitoring services. It's if you're a motor carrier and you get a load confirmation from a legitimate broker that you deal with, you get it in your email and it's not you, that's a red flag. Call the broker and let them know. A lot of times we've seen that happen and they're like, I didn't worry about it. That wasn't my load. Well, that means somebody has gone and impersonated you and maybe they've already got the instructions on where to pick up at and you've got the only thing that maybe can prevent it from happening. So I think just being vigilant around that. Obviously, any type of multi-factor authentication on any of the websites that you subscribe to is going to be important because you're seeing a lot of that and they get one password. Suddenly they can go and accept the tender. Suddenly they can log into freight broker websites. They can log into load boards. So, on that side of it too, protecting your identity also, have different passwords, change them regularly. There's a lot you can do there. And obviously from the freight broker side, being vigilant in the same way as it relates to any type of multi-factor authentication, any calls that you may get that suddenly they're on this load and that doesn't line up with how you view that. Getting in and jumping in quickly and figuring out where the problem is before this grows in scale, that's the biggest, that's the thing that people, when it does happen, you've got to act fast and you've got to go and figure out where the source of that is. But working with reputable carriers, monitoring them, vetting them, because oftentimes you're the ones that at the end of the day are going to pay the price when a load goes missing.
Yeah, and I'll echo your point regarding the password situation because we obviously in the channel side, I work with a lot of different partners. And even for my personal life, I know you've got a password here, a login here, a login there. And a lot of people, they do use the same email and the same password for multiple sites. And I think the fraudulent players are starting to figure that out. So if there's a breach on one site, they're trying these, are they just essentially then trying those passwords on your other sites
Yeah,
and saying, oh, I got in here too. So if you find out there's a breach, you're going to have to change all your passwords, unfortunately, or try to find a way to to really keep those in check. Is it's a simple thing to do. Can be a pain in the butt, but we have heard from partners that that type of thing is occurring. So now you're on the insurance coverage side. So
sure.
I'd be interested to let our audience know and let myself know, how does the insurance coverage kind of play a role in some of these different types of schemes? Because I think there may be a misconception under certain situations like, oh, it's fraud, so I shouldn't have to deal with it. My insurance is just going to handle it. But I'm guessing that there's a lot of intricacies in each situation that play a role in who's left holding the bag per se.
Absolutely. There's some, I think when you really go and look at this high level, you've got the cargo, piece of this. And so that load goes missing. If you've got contingent cargo today, that very well may not be covered because generally speaking, contingent cargo oftentimes is contingent on the insurance of the motor carrier. The motor carrier doesn't have insurance here because it's fraud. And so under that scenario, you could be left with a cargo loss. And there are some broader form contingent policies out there that will include things such as this, but I would say the majority do not. You've also got the ability to buy a primary cargo form, which is what we encourage every freight broker to be on, because that is going to respond, generally speaking. You got to understand your policy, but that policy is going to act on its own and subrogate back against the motor carrier when they have grounds to subrogate back. So the cargo loss certainly can be insured. The loss that really it's a question of circumstances is, let's say you are hit multiple times and you've got a broad cyber policy. There is an opportunity for cyber to respond, but typically there's a retention or deductible involved, and it's got to rise to a pretty large level for cyber to kick in and for you to have actual damages. And what we typically see is oftentimes this never gets to that level and it doesn't become worthwhile. Oftentimes the freight broker, just the legitimate carrier that hauled it, that should have vetted better but didn't, should have vetted the broker, the fraudulent broker, they're going to come back to somebody for payment. And a lot of times it is, well above a market rate, and you got a choice. You generally have to pay that motor carrier, and oftentimes that is straight out of pocket. And so I'm not saying that's not insurable, but it's got to rise to a pretty large level, and you're still going to be on the hook for a significant portion. In anything you're out in advance money, we typically don't see that as something that is insurable unless it rises to large levels. So a lot of times the money that you're out, it's going to be, you could be hit for $50,000, $100,000, but it may not rise to the level where a cyber policy is going to kick in.
Okay. And I think I heard you kind of say some of these or a lot of these situations that the carriers find themselves in might be related to, hey, I'm taking a load that's above market rate. So I think you said it earlier. The
Yep.
other important thing is if something feels off or something feels too good to be true, do your vetting, because
Yes.
yes, there are great loads out there and you can find these. I mean, that's why why a lot of people are in the spot market space. But again, I think it goes back to what you're saying, and I think what I've heard on other types of advice forums is, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, let's take a
Yeah,
closer
there's
look at
something off there.
that.
And if a freight broker, most reputable freight brokers do not use Hotmail and Gmail. If suddenly a very large freight broker is sending you a confirmation from Hotmail, that's not legitimate. So some of this is just the litmus test of, okay, something seems off here. And, at the end of the day, the freight broker and the motor carrier have got to work together here. And generally you can go back to something and you can find a scenario where it was preventable. But there are some out there right now that are very challenging when you've got a legitimate motor carrier that suddenly goes the other direction, and maybe it's a fraudulent sale of the authority for a an amount that's sent to them because they were going to go out of business, and they can then operate with all the credentials. That becomes much tougher to detect. There are certainly areas and ways that you can go and help prevent it, but it gets a lot more challenging when you get to that type of scenario.
Well, Chad, I'll have one last kind of final question or final thought for you here before we wrap up, and that's, how does these types of fraud schemes tend to impact profitability? Or is there a way to kind of describe that? Is it affecting the rates? Is it affecting the relationships? What are you kind of seeing these types of things, and how does it relate back to, I guess, profitability from a broker and carrier standpoint?
Well, I think from a broker standpoint, obviously where we're seeing it, we're seeing the profitability more impacted there, and that one, you have a potential for loss of revenue with the shipper, because if you lose a dozen loads for a Fortune 500 company, I've been in the brokerage world before and I've experienced this. You may not have that shipper for a while. So there's that piece of it that obviously that's the most dramatic impact. But two, generally there's a deductible attached. You're paying that even if you have primary cargo, you're paying the deductible on each load. And so that can add up, especially for a larger 3PL taking on a larger deductible. That can add up pretty quickly if you lose, 20 or 30 loads. And, your deductible's $50,000, you do the math there. That's a pretty large loss that is going to be impactful, especially at a time like today. So you have that piece of it. And then obviously the other multiple ways, having to go and pay the motor carrier that actually hauled the load. And a lot of this is not insurable. A lot of it is, but a lot of it's not. And so there's certainly the impact there. And I think to the motor carrier side, there's one, you may not get paid on that load. It may take you 6 months to even find the legitimate freight broker that actually had that load. You may never find it. So you've got that. You've also got the reputational risk out there of being listed or flagged in a lot of these carrier monitoring systems and not being able to get future shipments. So I think it's more reputational on the carrier side, but certainly there can be an impact to revenue as well if you're not able to recover.
Perfect. Well, Chad, I really appreciate your time today. Before I go, if you want to learn more about Reliance, you can actually find their listing on the Truckstop Partner Marketplace. That's marketplace.truckstop.com. Type in Reliance in the search bar. You get some information about them. Or where can they go to get more information about Reliance or get in touch with you guys directly?
Yeah, I think our website is probably the best place, reliancepartners.com. We've got 10 offices around the country, so very good chance there's an office location near you. We do a lot of business in the space, so if we can ever be helpful, more than happy to do that.
Perfect. Thank you, Chad. Appreciate your time. I'm Brett
Hey, thanks,
Jendra.
Brett. Take care.
See you later. Take care, everyone.
Bye.